Before we begin, just a little heads up. To make all of these care guides easy to follow, and to make my life easier, I'm going to make these guides in order of Pokedex number, which means that I'll be starting with the Bulbasaur line. For those that don't know, Bulbasaur and its sequential evolutions are dual grass poison types from the Kanto region. They're small, squat, quadrupedal Pokemon with a green mottled skin color. As a Bulbasaur, it has, well, a bulb on its back, which it's born with. This bulb helps the Pokemon by supplying nutrients and defense, as it's also the source of most grass-type attacks, such as Vine Whip and Razor Leaf. When it evolves into Ivysaur, it gets a bit taller and bulkier, and the bulb on its back begins to bloom into a large pink flower to accommodate for the higher nutritional needs. As a Venusaur, it gets much larger, but instead of getting much taller, it instead gets wider, almost seeming to get stockier as its feet grow further apart. Biologically speaking, it most likely has that body shape because the massive flower that's now on its back. This thing is the main reason that its average height is 6'7". I would guess that at least 3 feet of that is thanks to the flower. It is incredible. And it weighs a ton, figuratively speaking. I know there are some Pokemon out there that do weigh a literal ton. Hence why Venusaur has the stronger and shorter legs. And really, that's the whole overview of this line. So let's go through and see if the Bulbasaur line could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. One of the biggest things to consider for an enclosure for your Bulbasaur is the plant on its back. No matter how old your Pokemon is or what evolutionary stage it's at, this is one of the biggest and most important things to consider, especially if you have a newly hatched Bulbasaur. To that end, you either want an enclosure with a lot of sunlight spots for it to bask in, or if you plan on keeping your Bulbasaur and Ivysaur inside, then you want to have either a window that it can rest near, or a UV light that it can rest under so the bulb grows healthy. Aside from the sunlight, the Bulbasaur line do well in grassy fields or open forests. Oh, and what I mean when I say open forests is that there are gaps between the canopy that allow sunlight to slip through to the ground, there isn't much ground cover like bushes and vines, and the distance between the trees is open enough that it would allow a Venusaur to be able to slip through, if you have one. That does mean that you will be spending a lot of your time either keeping the grass mowed or trimming back tree branches or stuff like that. Lawn maintenance, basically. When it comes to activity, the Bulbasaur line are diurnal, meaning that they are active during the day and then sleep at night. Sleeping arrangements tend to be pretty simple for them, something along the lines of a large Pokemon house for either Bulbasaur or Ivysaur, or a shed for Venusaur with an appropriately sized Pokemon bed. Don't be too worried about decorating or upkeep or really even cleaning it that often. They won't be spending that much time inside of it aside from sleeping. The occasional sweep and disinfectant scrub should be good enough for the inside of their home. The last bit that I'm going to go over habitat-wise are other Pokemon that could be housed with the Bulbasaur line if you want to. There are some Pokemon that need to be housed together in packs, there are those that are probably best to leave by themselves, and there are also ones that can live with other Pokemon no problem, but can also be fine on their own. The Bulbasaur line neatly fits to the last category. They can live just fine with almost any other grass type, like an Oddish, or a Chikorita, or a Bellsprout. Bug Pokemon can be okay depending on which ones you have. The small ones like Caterpie or Grubbin are fine. They usually don't have the power to seriously damage even a young Bulbasaur. Weedles and other Pokemon known for their poison touch or barbs are probably a bad choice, as the poison can have a pretty strong effect on grass types like Bulbasaur. It starts to affect the bulb on their back, and that can make your Pokemon extremely sick, and that can lead to a trip to the Pokemon Center, and it's usually just best to avoid the situation altogether. Now, the dangerous bug types are the big ones like Heracross, Scolipede, or Yanmega. They're actually big enough and have enough power that they can damage even a fully grown Venusaur, let alone a newly hatched Bulbasaur. Unless you want some high-stakes Pokemon battles, don't put them together. Oh, And this should go without saying, but no fire-type Pokemon. It really won't end well if they get into a fight and you're not there to break it up. Availability. The Bulbasaur line are infrequent in the wild. And what I mean by that is that the Bulbasaur population, just like most starters, will go through certain cycles. Let me explain for those of you that don't really know. When the starter Pokemon were chosen as the starters for a certain region, that led to a boom in that Pokemon's popularity, which unfortunately led to a decline in the natural populations of these Pokemon as trainers started to go out and actively hunt for them. That's why, usually, these Pokemon are nearly impossible to find in the wild. As soon as someone finds a wild one, they get caught. Luckily, the governments around the world were able to set up large breeding programs for these Pokemon before the popularity took hold. But the starter programs are why you sometimes get large waves of these Pokemon in the wild. Starter trainers sometimes take to the breeding program, trying to get a rare genetic mutation of different pigmentation known as a shiny among trainers. And that's somewhat fine. After all, as a breeder myself, I would absolutely love to get a shiny Pokemon of any kind in my collection. However, the difference there is that while I would love to get a shiny, it isn't my end goal. If one would appear in one of my breeding programs, I'd probably scream in happiness for days on end, but it's not what I'm aiming for. I will take whatever comes out of that egg, shiny or not. The novice trainers that are only breeding for that shiny, well, that can lead to a lot of non-shiny eggs hatching and just being released into the wild. And I want to be clear here, it is very unlikely for you to get a shiny Pokemon. You could go through thousands of eggs before getting one. This is what leads to a nearly seasonal increase in numbers in the wild starter Pokemon population. And then, people notice this increase in population, and they go out and catch all of the newly hatched and wild starters, thus creating what I consider the starter Pokemon cycle, or the SPC. But that's why you will never see an Ivysaur or a Venusaur in the wild, because they all usually get caught when they're young. So if you want a Bulbasaur, your options are, unfortunately, limited. If you're lucky and happen to be in the Kanto or the Kalos regions when all the new trainers are trying to get their shinies, you may be able to catch one in the wild there. But keep in mind that thousands, possibly tens of thousands of other trainers are going to be hunting for the exact same thing as you. Another way you could probably get one is through the starter program. You sign up for a starter Pokemon, the government breeders produce just enough for their needs that year, and the Pokemon are handed out. Sounds great, but there are some roadblocks. First, and the biggest one, is the age limit. The oldest you can be and sign up for a starter initiative is 18, which rules out a lot of people. Secondly, you may have to wait quite a while for them to get to you in the starter programs. These programs have waiting lists that can be years long, so you might sign up 1 year and then not see a Pokemon for 2 or 3. The last and most unreliable method to try and get a Bulbasaur is to try and find a private breeder like me who has them for sale. And because of the difficulty in just getting one of these Pokemon, there aren't many out there that sell them. There are some, but they are far and few between, and their waiting lists tend to be years long. So I'm just going to say that getting a Bulbasaur will be hard, no matter how you plan on doing it. Care. Alright, let's say you beat the odds. The government either gave you a Bulbasaur, or you got one from a breeder, or you're one lucky person and managed to catch one of the failed shinies. Either way, you got your Bulbasaur, and you have their enclosure set up. Now you have to actually care for them. Number one thing is going to be food, and honestly, it's probably the easiest diet you're ever going to have to deal with. One word: sunlight. Yeah, Just like most grass types, the Bulbasaur line is at least partially able to sustain itself off sunlight, thanks to the bulb on its back. In fact, when a Bulbasaur is young, from newly hatched to about 6 months of age, that's all they need to sustain themselves. The body of the Bulbasaur is so small in relation to its bulb that the nutrients the bulb provides are enough to survive. And even as it ages and evolves, it's still going to sustain itself partially from the sunlight that the plant gets. But that's why the sunlight is so important. It needs it to be healthy. If the plant doesn't get sunlight, then it'll begin to wilt, which will cause problems with the Pokemon's health, and you'll have to make a trip to the Pokemon Center. So make sure your Bulbasaur has ample time to get in the sun throughout the day. For when your partner gets big enough that the sunlight won't be enough to sustain them anymore, which you'll know because your Bulbasaur will begin to gnaw on different plants around its enclosure, any mixture of berries will be enough for them. I personally have my own diet of berries that I keep my herbivorous Pokemon on, but I know other breeders out there have their own diet that they swear by, and there are those out there that just recommend store-bought kibble. In these videos, I'm going to be giving you what I feed my Pokemon, or what I would feed them if I had one of them. As for what berries I would use, that varies with the age of the Pokemon. When they're young, I like to give them things with plenty of protein, as their bodies will be using it to grow stronger and get bigger. To that end, I use a mixture of spellin and corn berries for the young Pokemon. Both of those berries are high in protein and generally low in fat content. As the Pokemon gets older, they'll require less protein and more of a balanced diet, though they will still need to build up protein stores in their body for when they evolve. It's hard to say when that time is, as even within one species of Pokemon, individuals can grow slower or faster, so I highly recommend frequent Pokemon Center visits so you'll know when it's time to start swapping their food out. I would swap out the corn berries for the pear berries, as it's a more well-rounded nutrient-based fruit. Now, of course, different evolutions need different amounts of food. For a Bulbasaur, you're going to want to give them about a ½ pound mix of mashed berries and sliced berries, more mashed when they're younger and more solid as they age. When they become an Ivysaur, you can change it to all sliced berries, maybe even whole berries if your Ivysaur is large enough. They are a bit bigger than a Bulbasaur, so you can up the amount of food to about 3/4 pound as well. Now, the biggest change is going to be when you get a Venusaur. The average weight of a healthy Ivysaur tends to hover around 30 pounds, give or take. Venusaur tend to be around 220 pounds. That is a big boy, and a big boy needs a big food dish. It's not as much as it could be, they still have the massive flower feeding them, but they are still going to need about 2 to 3 pounds of food a day. And that is why I grow my own berries in a big field behind my farm. Fully evolved Pokemon tend to take a lot of food to keep. Moving on, exercise and enrichment are pretty easy, honestly. They're usually most active as young Bulbasaur, but honestly, as long as they have an open place to walk around and explore, they should be fairly content with a few toys thrown in as well. And as they get older and begin evolving, they just get slower and more sedentary. Mostly due to that flower on their back. It gets so heavy and requires so much sunlight that Venusaurs and even older Ivysaurs can spend most of a day just lounging in one patch of sunlight. So don't be worried if your hyperactive, jumping around Bulbasaur evolves and suddenly just wants to lay in the sun. It's perfectly normal. The last thing that I'm going to cover care-wise is grooming. These Pokemon, especially for a young Bulbasaur, will need you to keep an eye on their shedding and grooming. And once again, it comes back to that flower on their back. Of course, there's bathing and cleaning up after them and all that, but that flower will need you to almost be a gardener as well. See, as seasons change and the Bulbasaur grows, the plant will change as well. The leaves on a Bulbasaur's bulb will fall away as the bulb grows, making room for newer, healthier leaves. The petals on an Ivysaur and Venusaur's flowers will do the same. The leaves and petals will turn brown and begin to fall off, which should happen on their own, but they can occasionally get stuck where they are. This will prevent the new growth from coming in and then can make your Pokemon sick if it stays there too long. So always keep an eye out for brown leaves in your Pokemon. If you see it, wait a day or two to see if it comes off on its own. If it's still there, simply grab the leaf or petal and gently peel it off the plant. It should come right off if it's ready. If it doesn't come off and it still seems to be attached to the plant, wait another day and try again. Keep this up until the petal or leaf just comes off on its own. I can't tell you how many horror stories I've heard from other breeders or rescue rangers about rescuing a Bulbasaur evolution who was not groomed properly. It's a simple thing, but it can do wonders for your Pokemon's health. Cost. Cost-wise, a Bulbasaur evolution is either going to be low or very low, as long as you ignore the Pokemon itself. But as soon as you add in the Pokemon, these things can get ridiculous. Unless you're lucky enough to get one from the starter program or find one in the wild, the only place you'll get one is through a breeder, like me, or a private seller, someone who has a Bulbasaur and is just selling it. And thanks to the popularity of these species, you'll be paying through the nose for that Bulbasaur. If I had a category above very high, I'd be placing Bulbasaur in that one. It's outrageous, but if you really, really want one, then you might be able to find one for that much. As for everything else involved with the Bulbasaur line, it shouldn't be too much. An outdoor habitat would be cheapest. I would recommend just starting with a shed from a Bulbasaur, because once it becomes a Venusaur, you'll just need to spend extra money to upgrade to a shed anyway. The price for that should be low, and your Bulbasaur will like the extra space to explore on rainy days, so it's a win-win. But if you need something on the very low side just for the first two forms, then you can find a decent outdoor Pokemon house pretty easy online. Like I said before, you don't need anything fancy here, just a large bed for it, a few toys to keep it entertained, and that's all. Always best to keep it simple. Food will be more expensive. I can't give exact prices as each store, city, and region has different prices for stuff, but I will say that for the first two evolutions, your food expenses will be very low per month. Buying in bulk will help it stay that way, and either freezing or refrigerating it will help keep it for longer. I would personally recommend getting one of those big chest freezers that people use for meat and putting your spare food in that. Trust me, it'll keep your food freezer and fridge from becoming packed with only Pokemon food. When I first started, I made that mistake, and it got to the point where there was more Pokemon food in my fridge than food for me. So a chest freezer will really help get rid of that problem early on. Anyway, food for the first two evolutions should be very low, but once they become a Venusaur, it's a whole nother matter. Feeding a Pokemon 2 pounds of berries every day will jump it up to a moderate pricing. Like I said, the best ways to lower that cost are buying in bulk, buying directly from the producer. A little hint, farmers tend to like selling directly to customers because they make more off the sale, so they tend to be cheaper than at a store. Or you can try growing the food yourself just to try and offset the cost. In all, it's not the worst that a Pokemon's food could cost. Conclusion. Taken as a whole, the Bulbasaur line of Pokemon has its ups and its downs. Extremely tough to get a hold of, but incredibly easy to care for once you are able to get one. Honestly, it's a great choice for any trainer starting out or for someone with more experience looking for an easy line to care for. The Kanto and Kalos region governments did a great job choosing Bulbasaur as a starter. Personally, I've known a few people in my life who've had Bulbasaurs, and they're wonderful creatures, absolutely fantastic. I've never tried to get one, a bit too expensive and rare for my tastes, but if you don't mind the scarcity, the grooming, and the space needed for a fully grown Venusaur, I would say that this would be a great Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for watching, and please join us again next time when we go over the Fire Starter of Kanto, the Charmander line. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Hello everyone, welcome back to our ongoing Pokemon Care Guides. Continuing on in Pokedex order, we move on to the Fire Starter line of Kanto, Charmander, and its later evolutions. The Charmander line are all variations of a bipedal reptile with an orange or red colored back and a yellow belly. But their most recognizable feature is the flame that perpetually burns at the tip of their tail. That in itself is a dead giveaway that you're looking at a Charmander evolution. But anyway, Charmander itself is a 2-foot tall, 19-pound orange reptile with a smooth, rounded head and big blue eyes. It's adorable, and there really isn't that much else to say about the first stage of this line. The next evolution, Charmeleon, while there isn't much difference between it and Charmander, it does get a bit bigger, at 3.5 feet and 42 pounds. It also now has a new crest on its head, and larger claws. The biggest change happens with the last evolution, however. Charizard gets significantly bigger than its previous evolutions, averaging 5.5 feet tall and almost 200 pounds. And yeah, I was surprised to find out that a Charizard is shorter than the average person too. It always looks so much bigger on TV. But anyway, Charizard also sports a set of impressive wings, used to lift it into the air, and for such a bulky looking Pokemon, it's pretty maneuverable up in the air. It also now has a longer neck and 2 horns jutting back from its head. It still has the signature flame at the end of its tail, but the tail is now much longer, used as a steering rudder while in the air. But let's be honest here, we all know what a Charizard looks like. Between multiple champions using one, it being the Kanto Fire Starter, and just the sheer popularity that Charizard enjoys, you've probably seen one somewhere. So, now that we have a general idea of the Pokemon line, let's go through and see if these could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Okay, since this is our first fire type, I'm going to say this here. Fire types can and will be some of the most challenging Pokemon to house, and for the exact reason that you're thinking of. Fire tends to burn things to the ground and hurt people and other Pokemon. So building them in enclosure, especially for the ones that have open flames on their bodies, will be a challenge. I should know. I got my Houndoom booster when he was just a newborn Houndour, and there are still burnt patches of my lawn from when he was still learning how to behave. Taking all of that into consideration, only experienced trainers should raise fire types in my opinion, simply because a fire type can cause massive amounts of damage and injury if not raised right. That being said, if you still think that you can handle and raise a fire type, a Charmander isn't the worst place you could start. This is a Pokemon line that I highly recommend that you keep in an outside enclosure. It is very easy for the fire on their tail to catch a piece of furniture or a wall, and suddenly you've got a house fire. As well, Charmeleon tend to go through a sort of rebellious, destructive phase, and they will claw up your walls and floor. Probably going to get irritating trying to repair that all the time. And when you get a Charizard, having it live outside goes from a suggestion to a necessity. Charizards need to be able to fly to stay healthy, and unless you're willing to let your Charizard out every time it has to take to the sky, or install a retracting roof on your house, it will need to live in an outside enclosure. Considering that it'll end up living outside anyway, it will probably be easiest to have it live outside just from the beginning. Now, when they were abundant in the wild, Charmander and its ensuing evolutions were all mountain-dwelling Pokemon. They would spend their time roaming rocky cliffs and going in and out of caves for shelter. So, for that reason, the enclosure for your Charmander should look like you stole part of a mountainside. Large piles of rocks for it to climb up and down so it can wear down its claws, a rough rocky ground so they don't accidentally set anything on fire, and a cave that's big enough and deep enough that they'll be able to escape from any rain or bad weather. Of course, as the Pokemon evolves, it will need more and more space for it to roam, and a larger cave for it to bed down in. I'm sure you're sitting there thinking, great, I don't have a large rocky area with a cave for my Charmander, guess I'm not getting that. Well, hold on. You aren't the first person to run into this problem. And there is a solution out there if you're willing to pay for it. Certain companies around the world offer to build what they call synth mountain habitats for Pokemon like the Charmander line. It's essentially a rock-like material similar to plastic that can resist the heat coming off of most fire types. They can build you anything you need, and they charge by the half acre. At a minimum, a Charmander will need at least a half acre for its habitat. They're usually an inquisitive species, so they need the space to explore and stay entertained. And when they evolve into a Charmeleon, they'll need double the space, a full acre. After evolving, the Charmeleon will take that space and begin to claim it as its territory. That's why in the wild, while Charmander would linger in groups and stay together, once they evolved, they tended to separate and go out on their own. They each need to take their own territory. After evolving again, while similar Pokemon of the same size would need more space, Charizard will only need about an acre and a half, because really, it'll be spending a lot of its time up in the air, only returning to the area that it's claimed as its territory for meals, resting, and interaction with its trainer. As for the cave, I would recommend getting one size for a Charizard right away. That means that the opening of the cave will need to be big enough for a fully grown Charizard, so around 6 feet tall and 5 feet wide, slightly larger than the wingspan of an average Charizard. This will allow them to land and fly out of the entrance of their cave. Depth-wise, you'll want to make it about 10 feet deep, that way it'll offer even larger than normal Charizard space to get away from the opening in case of a bad storm. Again, if you don't live on the side of a mountain with the appropriate cave system, don't worry. The same companies that I mentioned before, the ones that make the synth mountains, also make caves out of it for the exact same reason. Just be aware, again, it won't be cheap. Pokemon that can be housed with them are, well, not many. Charmander, like I said earlier, tend to form packs together, so they like to hang out with other Pokemon, and even when with grass and fairy types, they won't usually attack or harm them. But the instant they evolve, that usually changes. Charmeleon and Charizard will pick fights with whatever they are living with. I'm talking about anything, water types, grass types, electric types, people if they aren't well trained enough. Anything is fair game to them because they need to establish a dominance hierarchy in their territory. And yes, while it has been observed that some Charizards sometimes ignore Pokemon that are weaker than them, it's still taking a big risk to intentionally stick a weaker Pokemon with a Charmeleon or Charizard and hope that it won't attack it. If, and this is the only exception that I would make to this rule, but if the Pokemon was well trained as a Charmander and was properly and carefully socialized throughout all of its evolutions, then you may be able to have it coexist well with other Pokemon. Training is a big factor in that, and an important part of raising a Charmander line Pokemon effectively, which I'll go over in the care section of this guide, but just be sure that if you're going to put another Pokemon with your Charmander evolution after the Charmander stage, they need to be very well trained. Availability. Unfortunately, due to the Charmander's status as a starter Pokemon, they suffer from the same thing as the Bulbasaur line. Actually, they may be scarcer if you can believe it. The pure popularity that Charizard enjoys means that their catch window in the SPC, watch my Bulbasaur video if you don't know what that means, I explain it there, is nearly non-existent. Almost as soon as shiny breeders hatch and release one, it gets caught by someone else. And of course, this non-existent wild population mixed with the popularity means that if you are able to find a private seller willing to sell you a Charmander evolution, it's gonna be a lot of money. Thankfully, I have noticed in recent years that more and more private breeders are attempting to start breeding Charmanders, so that price may come down in the coming future, but don't expect it to drop anytime soon. Between the needed rocky environment, the fact that they can be so aggressive, and the government regulations on starter breeding, it can be a hardy investment just to start producing Charmanders. In all honesty, I would say your best shot is to get approved for the government starter program and sign up for a Charmander. It'll only cost you the entrance fee, and you'll usually only have to wait a year or two on the waiting list, which, yeah, may seem like a long wait, but trying to get it the other way could take you a lot longer. At least this way, you're guaranteed one eventually. If you're over 18, then I suppose you could find someone and pay them to sign up to the program for you. Not terribly ethical, but if the person's eligible and okay with giving you the starter, then why not? But yeah, trying to get a Charmander anywhere will be rough. Care. Food for the Charmander line is both simple and a pain in the butt to take care of. The Charmander line are carnivorous, if you couldn't tell by their sharp teeth, and as such, will require meat for their meals. For smaller Pokemon like Charmander and Charmeleon, I like to make a kind of meat mixture of Tauros meat and bird meat. The kind of bird doesn't really matter too much, it could be Pidgey, P-Dove, or even Taillow or Starly, but the mixture of the two kinds of meat offers at least some kind of variety of the kinds of prey they would be getting in the wild. The only additions that you'll have to add in is some calcium powder and some multivitamins to promote growth and immune health. Now the amount is a little tricky. If you look at the feeding amount for other reptilian Pokemon of the same size, you'll find that the Charmander line requires more food than the other species. This is because of the fire typing. The need to keep its body temperature high and to generate flame as a defense mechanism means that the Pokemon usually need more food than other types. Electric types tend to follow that rule too, but instead of more food in general, they need more sugar for energy generation. So for a Charmander, you'll want to give them about 2 pounds every 3 to 4 days. Remember, the Charmander evolutions are still reptilian, and so they don't metabolize as fast as most mammalian Pokemon. Yes, they are fire types, so they do metabolize fast for reptiles, but not when compared to mammals. The way their biology is set up is that if they get a good meal, then they'll be good for a few days afterward. Charmeleon's diet doesn't change too much from Charmander's. Of course, they're bigger, so when they evolve, you'll want to up their food immediately to 3.5 pounds of food every 4 days. Make sure to still dust their food with those supplements though. These supplements are to replace the stuff they'd get from eating the bones or the organs of their prey. Since they aren't getting that from the mixed meat we're giving them, the supplements that we are giving them take up that job. Now, when your Pokemon evolves for the final time, the food will jump again. Not only because it's bigger, but also because it becomes a flying type, so it's going to burn more energy flying around than its previous evolutions did just by walking. So because of its size and energy consumption, Charizard's food intake will bump to a whopping 5.5 pounds of mixed meat every week. The only benefit here is that while Charizard requires more food per meal, the length of time between meals is actually longer than its previous evolutions because it's not growing anymore. Even so, 6 pounds of meat a day can be quite a bit of meat. I would suggest ordering in bulk and trying to keep it stored as long as you can. As for exercise, I have one word for you: training. And I don't mean battle training either, I'm talking behavioral training. Things like don't set people on fire, no biting, no setting other Pokemon on fire, no running away, no setting buildings on fire. Really, just making sure it doesn't burn anything or anyone to the ground. If nothing else, I would say that this is the most important part of taking care of your Charmander. Shoot, of caring for any fire-type Pokemon. For your and anyone else's safety, do not let the training fall by the wayside. Okay, now with that warning out of the way, it's best for you to start training early when your Pokemon is still a Charmander. Charmanders are generally easy to work with, and if done at a young age, the habits will settle into their minds better. You can still work with the older evolutions, but it's going to be a much bigger challenge to change their behavior since it's already ingrained. Water in a spray bottle acts as a good deterrent for negative behavior, and small little chunks of meat, either tauros or poultry, for positive reinforcement of good behavior. Now, I've never taken care of a fire-type Pokemon before except for Booster, and when I got him, the lady that sold him to me took care of his training, so I can't give you in-depth detail of how to train your Charmander. But there are a few things I know are good for training. First is socialization around other people and Pokemon. Getting your Charmander used to being calm around random people and Pokemon will help temper the fighting instinct they get as a Charmeleon and a Charizard. Taking the later evolutions to a Pokemon gym every now and then, just to get some of their fighting instincts worked out, might be a good idea if there's one nearby you as well. It will help the Pokemon differentiate between time to fight and time to stay calm. The second thing to keep in mind is enrichment. Things that will tire out their bodies and minds are best, as it'll keep them from getting into trouble. For Charmanders, just playing with you and toys will be enough for them. Maybe get some of those toys that you can hide treats in, so they have to figure out how to get them out. That's good for their minds and tends to keep most Pokemon busy for some time. Charmeleons will require a bit more work than that though. From my research, an obstacle course would be best. Nothing fancy, just some ramps, tunnels, even use the rock piles that you'll have in their enclosure as climbing structures. And then, as a Charizard, you'll still be using the obstacle course you have set up for your Charmeleon, but now you'll have to add in some aerial maneuvers to that list as well. I'll be the first to admit that I don't know the first thing about teaching a Charizard to perform anything in the air, but there are plenty of books and people out there that are willing to help you out. One good example of an aerial obstacle is you throwing hoops in the air and your Charizard having to fly through them before they land on the ground. Keep in mind, all of this exercise isn't just to keep your Pokemon in shape. Between the toys and the obstacle course, it will be giving your Pokemon something to keep their minds focused on. It's like giving them a job. They spend a lot of their focus on getting through the obstacle course so that they don't have the focus to spend on getting into trouble. Now, the last thing I'm going to go over care-wise for Charmander line is actually not something that you have to do, but something that you have to keep an eye on, as it'll help immensely with knowing what's going on with your Pokemon. The flame on the tip of these Pokemon's tails are almost like a health and mood indicator. When the flame dwindles or shrinks in size, it means that the Pokemon is either sad, or injured, or sick. If you notice that your Pokemon's flame seems smaller than it normally is, which, as you spend time with your Pokemon and get to know them, it'll be easier for you to tell when the flame is not its normal size, then it would be best to take them to a Pokemon Center as soon as possible. The medical professionals there will be able to help you from there. Now, if it goes the other way and the flame gets bigger and hotter, that's not a good sign either. With the Charmander group, this means that the Pokemon is angry and gearing up for a battle. Whatever triggered this response in them, whether it's you, or another person, or another Pokemon, then slowly remove whatever it is from the situation and give your Pokemon time to calm down. It's best to always keep one eye on that flame, especially when you and the Pokemon are getting to know each other. It will make your life a lot easier and a lot safer. Cost. So, the cost of these Pokemon isn't going to be as low as the Bulbasaur line. And the most expensive part, I guarantee, will be the enclosure. Well, I mean, unless you currently live near or on a mountain, then you don't have to do anything to set up for your Pokemon. But, for those of us who are unlucky enough to not live near a giant natural rock, setting up the mountainous habitat isn't going to be cheap. In fact, it's almost certainly that it's going to be in the very high category. Needing to have a company make, haul, and set up fire-resistant rock will greatly cut into your wallet, and honestly is the biggest deterrent to people and breeders hoping to own fire-type Pokemon that have open flames in their bodies. The best way that I can offer to mitigate the cost is to build the enclosure in sections. When you have a Charmander, build an enclosure that's just big enough for the Charmander. Then, when it evolves, expand it to the right size for a Charmeleon, and then do the same when you get a Charizard. In the end, you'll be paying the same thing no matter what, and if you can afford the whole thing right from the beginning, then I would suggest that, but doing it in sections can help to spread that cost out across multiple years. The Pokemon itself is going to be the same as Bulbasaur. After all, it is still a starter Pokemon and suffers from the same rarity that they all do. To that end, unless you can get one from the starter program in Kanto or Kalos, which I still stand by as the best way to get any of these starter Pokemon, then a Charmander will cost you just as much of a Bulbasaur, if not more. So this Pokemon is sitting squarely in the very high price category. And sorry, but there isn't really any other way to lower that cost. Food, as well, is going to be just as expensive as everything else. For a Charmander and even a Charmeleon, you're looking at the high category for the meat and the supplements. And then, once you get a Charizard, it's going to jump to the very high category simply because of how much this Pokemon eats. Both the Tauros meat and the poultry are not too expensive in and of themselves, but the amount that you'll be buying is what's going to make this expensive. Buying this stuff in bulk will really help you out keeping the cost as low as possible. Then, freezing any extra meat you have for the next feeding will be really useful, as it'll make it so that you don't have to make a weekly trip to the grocery store. Conclusion. So, when I started this guide, I knew that this species was going to be one of the ones that everyone wants. I mean, who wouldn't? But when all the facts are laid out in front of them, then they'd start to reconsider. Between the prohibitive costs of keeping something like a Charizard, the territorial nature that's common among the older evolutions, and the massive time and training need to make sure this Pokemon is behaved and a good companion, it can be very time and money intensive to keep one of these evolutions. It's the reason that I never had one. Never had the time to devote to just that one Pokemon. Really, I personally only know one person who has one of these Pokemon, and that's the person I got Booster from. Bex is a Pokemon Ranger who owns a Fire Pokemon Rescue Center, and I'll tell you, she's a professional when it comes to Fire-type Pokemon, and whew, raising a Charizard has been a handful even for her. Now, I'm not saying don't get one. If you are up for the challenge and think you can do it, then go ahead. I simply want to make sure that you have all the info before rushing out and getting one. The last thing I want is for someone or a Pokemon to get hurt just because they weren't ready for this kind of challenge. But if you listen to all of this guide and still think that one of the Charmander evolutions is right up your alley, then I'm glad that I could help you find your perfect Pokemon partner. Thank you all for watching, and please join us again next time when we go over the Water-type Kanto starter Squirtle. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides. Today, we'll be wrapping up the Kanto starter Pokemon with the Water-type Squirtle and its evolutions. Now, these little guys are freaking adorable. Squirtle is just this small, bipedal, blue turtle-esque creature whose entire torso is covered by a shell that is brown on the top and a light, almost cream color on the bottom. They have stubby little legs and arms with this big round head and small curly tail. And honestly, that description could fit the entire evolutionary line. While bigger, a Wartortle has the same basic shape as a Squirtle, it's just that its tail becomes covered with this smooth, water-resistant hair, and it gains these almost wing-like ears that it uses to help it swim. Oh, and it jumps from Squirtle's 1.5 feet tall and 20 pounds up to 3 feet tall and 50 pounds. But once it evolves again, it loses the tail and ears and instead gets two massive cannons that sit on Blastoise's shoulders, extending out of the shell and over its arms. Blastoise shoots up to an average height of just over 5 feet tall, and gains another 130 pounds, most of which is shell. But, like I said, it keeps the same basic shape through all of its evolutions. Blue skin, round head, torso encased in a brown and cream shell. Honestly, out of the 3 Kanto starter Pokemon, I say that this is the one that changes the least as it evolves. At least it makes it easy to identify. And now that you have a good idea of the Pokemon that we'll be working with, let's get into the guide and see if this is the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Enclosure. If I had to rank the enclosures of the 3 Kanto starter Pokemon on how tough and expensive they were to build and keep, Bulbasaur would be the easiest, Charmander would be the hardest, and Squirtle would be sitting right in the middle of that range. It won't need the extensive terraforming that a Charmander will, but you'll have to put in more work than just letting your Bulbasaur wander around your yard all day. After all, Squirtle is a water type, and most water types will need water, obviously. Now, the amount and size of the water differs with each Pokemon species. You can have a Pokemon like a Quagsire, which honestly just needs a wet patch of mud that it can lay in, or you can have a Wailord, which you'll not be keeping anywhere but in the actual ocean. Squirtle, thankfully, is not that extreme. A small lake would be perfect for all 3 of the evolutions. It would provide an excellent amount of space for even a Blastoise. Now, let's say you don't have a full-on lake on your land like most people. Well, by the time you get a Blastoise, you'll need to get a decent-sized in-ground pool, about 25 meters in length, and the majority of which will need to be between 10 to 15 feet in depth. Plenty of your space for your massive turtle to swim around in. But if you are short on money or space when you first get the Pokemon, there is another option for the younger evolutions. With a Squirtle and a Wartortle, you may be able to get away with an above-ground pool, one of the larger ones. This will provide enough space for your Pokemon to swim around and exercise in the water without breaking your bank. And yeah, it may seem like a lot of space for your tiny Squirtle before it evolves, and you're right on that, but trust me when I say that it'll make your lives easier when it evolves into a Wartortle to have all that pool already set up for it. A couple things to keep in mind if you are going to use the pool method though. Do not put any cleaning chemicals in it like chlorine. These can be really bad for your Pokemon's health and cause all kinds of problems. This will mean that things like algae will start to grow, and the water will turn green, so to prevent that, I would get one of those underwater vacuums that cleans the bottom of the pool, and some form of filter to keep the water from getting stagnant and gross. You will also need a dry place near the water where your Pokemon can dry off and just hang out near the water's edge. This will also provide them with an easy way to get in and out of the water if they need to. With water Pokemon, you always need to keep in mind that there are 2 kinds. The fully aquatic ones that need to always stay in the water, and the semi-aquatic ones that do need the water but can't live in it full time. The Squirtle line is semi-aquatic, so whatever enclosure you build for them will require a way for them to leave the water at any point. If you are using an above-ground pool, then I would highly suggest building a deck alongside it to function as this little dry patch. For the in-ground pool that Blastoise will need, just make one side a shallow ramp that leads up and out of the pool. With their large bulky shell and proportionally short legs, a Blastoise won't be able to jump out of the water like a Squirtle can, so the ramp needs to go all the way out to the end of the pool. Lastly are the Pokemon that can be housed alongside these Pokemon. The easy answer is other Squirtle evolutions. They don't have the same intense territorial behavior of the Charmander evolutions, and even enjoy hanging out together in a nest. Yes, that is the right collective noun of a bunch of turtles, even as a Blastoise. The only thing to consider is that for each of these Pokemon you get, you will need to double the space requirement that I mentioned earlier. For Squirtle, that's not a big deal. You can realistically fit up to 4 of them in one of those above-ground pools without it being detrimental to their health. But for Wartortle and especially Blastoise, you'll need to double what I said above. Like I said in the past 2 care guides, fully evolved Pokemon do tend to take up a lot of space. Aside from that, lake fish Pokemon can be housed in the water with your Squirtle evolution as long as you have the space requirements met for the fish as well. Care guides for those will be out in the future. Just keep in mind that the Squirtle line are all omnivorous, meaning they eat both plant and meat. So if you have any fish that are small enough for them to fit into their mouth, they're going to try to eat them. I would suggest things like Magikarp and Feebas. They are two species that are big enough to not get eaten, but weak enough that they won't pose a danger to your Squirtle. Just make sure to seed the bottom of the enclosure with a few Everstones to keep these Pokemon from evolving. It might delay your Squirtle from evolving somewhat, but since they only spend some of their time in the water, they will still evolve eventually. Trust me, a delay in getting a Wartortle or a Blastoise is a lot better than suddenly having to take care of a Gyarados or a Milotic. I know those care guides aren't out yet, but trust me when I say you'll need a lot more space than the pools I've recommended here. Availability. Just like the other two Kanto starter Pokemon, Squirtle unfortunately suffers from the same availability problem. Luckily, their catch window in the SPC isn't nearly as small as Charmander's is. In fact, a Squirtle may be the easiest one to find in the wild as long as you know where to look. Squirtle like to live in and near lakes and ponds, both of which have plenty of underwater hiding areas and murky water that a Squirtle can easily use to hide in. This means that out of the 3 Kanto starter Pokemon, a Squirtle is most likely to be missed or overlooked by a trainer wandering around in the wilderness. Camping out on the shore of a lake in the Kanto region and watching to see if any Squirtle appear in the shores might just give you the chance to catch a wild Squirtle. It's a very low chance. Like I've said in the last 2 starter videos, wild starter Pokemon get caught pretty much the instant that a shiny hunter releases them. But if you are too old for the starter program and can't afford one from the few breeders that produce them, then staking out a lake might give you the chance to catch one. As always, my recommendation is to either sign up for the government starter program or pay someone to sign up for you. Sure, you may have to wait some time for them to breed enough to fill up your order, but it's still a guaranteed Pokemon. Care. Unlike the other 2 Kanto starters, the care for Squirtle and its evolution involves a lot more care for its enclosure as opposed to the Pokemon itself. For a Bulbasaur and Charmander, you set up the enclosure and then just do minor maintenance on it. But with water Pokemon in general, their enclosures need constant upkeep. The number one thing is that you need some sort of circulation system. This is the one thing you need to have, even if you're using a lake instead of a pool. It will help keep the water from becoming stagnant, gross, and full of diseases. Standing water turns into bad water. You can get a sort of fountain to go in the center of your lake that will help stir up the water and aerate it. Or, if you're using a pool, most of them come with their own circulation and filtration systems. That's as much as you have to do for a lake, but the pool will need constant skimming to try and keep the water from filling with dirt, leaves, and waste from your Pokemon. Even with this, if you're using a pool, you'll still have to drain the pool around once a month to change out the water. Remember, there's no chemicals in the water to clean it. They can be harmful to your Pokemon's health. But that also means that even with the circulation and the skimming, the water will eventually turn green. Once it reaches a point where you can no longer see the bottom of the pool through the water, it's time to change it. Of course, if you're using a lake, then you don't have to do that. The lake water is going to be filthy no matter what, and you will have the ecosystem to keep it healthy. Moving on to the Pokemon itself, food is going to be fairly easy to handle. As I said before when talking about the fish that can live with them, the Squirtle evolutions are omnivorous, meaning they can eat both meat and berries. Now, I prefer to feed only berries when I can. You can grow your own, they aren't very expensive if you need to buy a ton of them all at once, and they're easier to keep fresh. But if you do decide to feed your Squirtle meat, then that's absolutely fine. Either way, your average Squirtle will need about 1.5 cups of food per day. As I mentioned in my Bulbasaur video, the berries that I like to use are the Spellin and the corn berries. Mash them into a kind of fruit paste when they're younger, as it will be easier for them to eat. As they get closer to becoming a Wartortle, you can instead just slice the fruit into small chunks for them to eat. Meat-wise, I would suggest Magikarp, as it's a very common meat for people to just get a hold of, and they're the natural prey of Squirtle in the wild anyway. No need to cook it or anything, just slice it into cubes that are about half the size of the Pokemon's mouth, just to make sure that there isn't the possibility of them choking. They don't have teeth after all, so they tend to either swallow something whole or take large bites out of it, and then swallow that bite whole. Oh, and one thing I would like to add on before moving on to the other evolutions, Squirtle's shell is made of hardened bone that extends from its spine and ribcage. To ensure that these bones grow healthy, nice, and strong, it's important to make sure that a Squirtle gets a decent level of calcium in its diet. The way they do this in the wild is by eating the bones of their prey, but that can present a major choking hazard to your Pokemon, and there are plenty of people that find feeding your Pokemon bones to be rather disturbing. An easy workaround for this is dusting the food that you're going to feed it with calcium powder. You can get it from most Pokemon care stores, and just a light sprinkling over the food will be plenty for any of the evolutions. Moving on to the Wartortle, the amount of food will almost double, going up to 2 2/3 of a cup of food, whether it be berries or meat. The meat you can leave in larger chunks now, and the fruit can just be sliced up, or if your Wartortle is big enough when it's closer to evolving, then you can just feed them the whole berry. Still going to need to dust with calcium powder though, don't forget about that. As they grow and evolve, they use that calcium to grow and repair that shell, so it's very important that they have enough of it to do so. Blastoise is another one of the big boy third evolutions, and as such requires a truly massive amount of food. Based on the average weight of a Blastoise, you'll be feeding them an incredible 7.5 cups of food. At this point, you can just start throwing whole fruit into the water for them. While they do tend to take the most food and most space to care for, feeding the final evolutions does tend to be the easiest, and at least to me, the most fun. I mean, just walking up and hucking food into an enclosure for some big, powerful Pokemon is oddly satisfying. At least to me it is. But throwing full fruit into the pool for your Blastoise has benefits and drawbacks. One good thing is that it also acts as playtime for your Pokemon. It's having to chase down and catch the fruit bobbing on the water surface is a good enrichment activity for them. The downside is that not only do Blastoise still need the calcium supplement for their food to help with shell health, but since they evolved the cannons, they also need iron supplements as well. With how high pressure the water coming out of those cannons is, they can get worn down very, very quickly. The iron supplements will make sure that Blastoise always have a good internal supply of iron to heal those cannons with. If you plan on just chucking the fruit into the pool, that'll wash off any supplement powder that's on them, and instead of your Pokemon eating it, it'll instead just gunk up the water. You'll have to buy these supplement pills and either jam them inside the fruit before feeding, or give them to your Blastoise directly. Personally, I would just put them in the fruit. It's less hassle overall, and if you're feeding them meat, then you can just keep using the powder. I wouldn't recommend throwing the meat into the water the same way as the fruit. If your Blastoise isn't hungry when you first throw it in the water, then the water will saturate the food and make it all soggy and gross, and it'll start to deteriorate and break down, and then the water gets all gross, and you'll need to be changed again, and it's honestly best to keep the meat out of the water. Grooming will also be a big part of taking care of your Pokemon. Now, you might be wondering, grooming? Grooming what? It's not like Squirtle has any hair that needs to be brushed. And you would be right about that, but they do have a shell. You see, they spend a lot of time just relaxing near or even in the water. Their shells can end up getting gross from that. Algae will start to form in the creases of the shell's plates, and if left long enough, can spread across the rest of the shell. This can become a serious health concern, as it traps in water and can cause the shell to begin to rot. Thankfully, a weekly brushing with soap and a stiff bristle brush will be good enough to clean it off. This is a small thing, but it's needed. For a Wartortle specifically, it also has the tail and the ears that'll need to be brushed out as well. They can get tangled and won't dry properly if they get left that way. Just some Pokemon safe soap and conditioner with a brush can help take care of this problem, or a pair of scissors if it gets bad enough. Blastoise again has the shell that'll need to be brushed, but its cannons will also need to be scrubbed clean. If you have water with a lot of minerals in it, then that can cause a buildup of mineral deposits in the barrels of its cannons when leftover water dries. If not dealt with, then eventually these could lead to a blocked cannon and a trip to the Pokemon Center to get rid of it. Two things can be done to deal with this. The first is to skip the problem altogether by buying a massive filter that you can install in your Pokemon's enclosure that'll filter out all the minerals of the water. It just prevents the buildup to begin with. But buying the system itself and all the replacement filters can get expensive, especially if you'll be changing it often due to the amount of water you'll be filtering. The second way to get rid of the buildup is constant scrubbing with a stiff wire brush, and mind, this may sound a little weird, but normal berry juice. Yeah, that really sour bright yellow berry, its juice is really good at dissolving crusted on things, like the mineral buildups in a Blastoise's cannon, as long as you don't get the kind that's marketed towards kids. They add a ton of sugar to it to make it more sweet than sour, and that can dilute the effectiveness as a cleaning agent. When cleaning with it, take enough of the juice to saturate the entire affected area, and then give it a good vigorous scrubbing with the wire brush. The minerals should start to break up and have your Blastoise fire its cannons to clear out all the debris and berry juice. Then, if there's still some leftover buildup after that, repeat until clean. Afterward, just to stay on top of it, it's best to use the berry juice about once a week to keep it from getting built up again. If there are no mineral deposits in the cannon, then just one fruit's worth of juice should be enough to coat the entirety of the inside of the cannons. Funny enough, you can also use this technique to clean your pipes around your house, so hey, at least there's that. Cost. Since we're talking about another starter Pokemon, the cost again is going to be very high. Finding a breeder for Squirtle, while not as hard as finding a Charmander breeder, is going to be difficult. For water Pokemon, the large ones at least, it tends to be easier and cheaper to find them in the wild than to breed them. It requires a lot of space and habitat construction, so in essence, if you do find a breeder, you'll be paying a lot not just because of how rare the Pokemon is, but also because it is expensive to simply house enough to sustain a breeding population. Take it from me, breeders have bills to pay too. Speaking of the enclosure, that is definitely going to be in the very high category as well. On one hand, you'll have to buy, set up, and then maintain multiple different kinds of pools. Between the price of the pool, the permits needed to build them, the additions to your water bill from draining and filling it once a month or so, and actually building the thing, you're looking at a hefty price tag. On the other hand, if you need to buy a house that has access to a lake on your land, which, that might be one of the most expensive things I'm ever going to mention on these guides. Now, I'm not going to get into the housing market in this show, it's called Pokemon Care Guide, not House Care Guide, but, in my inexperienced opinion, if you really want to buy a lakefront house just to raise a Squirtle, then check the Sinnoh region. They have a ton of lakes there. They are bound to have at least one house for sale near one of them. But again, it's probably going to be cheaper just to raise your Squirtle in a pool as opposed to buying a whole new house. The food, supplements, and grooming supplies altogether will be a monthly moderate expense when taken all together. After all, you'll always need to buy food. You'll always need to buy more soap and more normal berry juice as time goes by. Luckily, you can get all of these things in bulk, cutting down the price on everything. If you want to cut the price down even more and are willing to put the work in, you can also grow your own berries to mitigate the cost completely. But if you're planning on using meat, then be prepared for it to be a bit more expensive. Meat always costs more than fruits and veggies. Out of everything, the supplements will probably be the most expensive thing you'll have to keep buying, but again, if you buy them in bulk, they tend to be cheaper, and they take forever to go bad as long as you keep them in a sealed container. And then the brushes you'll need for grooming can be picked up at any old Pokemon care shop, or even ordered online. In total, the initial investment of getting a Squirtle is going to be a big one. A lot of capital will go into getting it and then setting up its enclosure. Almost a prohibitive amount of capital. But once you have all that set, then the day-to-day care shouldn't cost you much a month. Altogether though, I'm going to have to place Squirtle and its evolutions into the very high category of pricing. These starter Pokemon are no joke to get a hold of and to care for. Conclusion. Overall, I don't think that the Squirtle line is a bad Pokemon to have. They're easy to care for and generally have a friendly and playful temperament. On a personal level, I think that they're my favorite one out of the 3 Kanto starter Pokemon. But coming from a professional standpoint as a breeder, they take a lot of investment just to keep properly outside of a Pokeball. The enclosure and, of course, getting the Pokemon is a royal pain. It's the reason that there are so few breeders like me out there that are trying to breed and sell them. But if you ignore all of that, they are a fantastic evolutionary line. The few that I've interacted with have been wonderful Pokemon. And hopefully, if you manage to get your hands on one, it'll turn out to be your perfect Pokemon partner. Thank you all for tuning in, and please join us again next time when we leave behind the starter Pokemon and dive into the cute, friendly bug Pokemon Caterpie and its evolutions Metapod and Butterfree. Have a wonderful night, everyone. And so here we are, moving past the 3 starter Pokemon and getting into the real meat of the Kanto Pokedex. No more talking about how scarce they are because of the SPC, or how you have to pay a breeder out the butt just to get one. Now, we can get more into the common boys and girls. To kick us off, let's talk about bugs. Specifically, Caterpie and its following evolutions. So, Caterpie is a small, foot-long, green bug Pokemon with suction cup-like feet along the bottom of its body and a large red horn-like protrusion on its forehead. I'm sure almost everyone has seen them outside at some point. They're very, very common, especially in the warmer months. Caterpie then evolves into its next stage of Metapod, which is its chrysalis form between the first and third evolution. Metapod looks like a small green crescent moon that has 2 eyes near the top. Shortly after becoming a Metapod, the Pokemon will evolve again and become a Butterfree, a 3-foot-tall butterfly with white and black wings and a purple center body. They're most common in the Kanto region, of course, but they can also be found all over the world. Despite being small prey Pokemon, they've become very successful everywhere they're introduced. But just because it's common doesn't mean that it's the right Pokemon for everyone. So let's get into it and see if these are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. For the first 3 care guides that I've done for the Kanto starters, the enclosures for 2 out of 3 of them have been fairly large and involved, changing at least part of the environment around them. For Caterpie and its subsequent evolutions, it's almost the exact opposite situation. You see, for your Caterpie to live healthy and happy, it really only requires one thing. A tree. Any old tree. Look outside. Do you see a tree? If so, then you already have the perfect habitat for a wild Caterpie to live in. Now, I'm going to suggest a different kind of enclosure that'll keep your Caterpie from wandering off and, more importantly, being taken as prey by one of the many predators that they have. That's not to say that you couldn't just put your Caterpie in a tree and leave it there. You absolutely could. My parents do, and they raise enough Caterpie to cover a couple dozen trees. But that does hold a lot of risks for your Pokemon. So I'm going to tell you how to set up an enclosure that'll keep your Pokemon happy without putting it at risk. When making an enclosure for your Caterpie, the big things to keep in mind are warmth, vertical space, and climbing decor. Let's talk vertical space first. Caterpie love to climb. It's almost the only thing they ever do besides eat. So, when making your Pokemon's enclosure, you'll want to make the frame in the dimensions of 3 feet by 3 feet on the bottom and then 5 feet tall. The frame can be made out of any material. Caterpie can climb anything with their suction cup feet, but the easiest to get a hold of and build with would probably be wood. The walls of the enclosure bring me to the next topic: warmth. Caterpie, its evolutions, and most other bug-type Pokemon live in warmer climates. If you live somewhere like Alola where it's warm all the time, then you can set up your Caterpie's enclosure outside and even use a netting for the walls to allow good airflow through the enclosure. Now, that's not needed for the Pokemon's health, but if you are going to have netting, then you're going to want the airflow for yourself, because the red horn that Caterpie has reeks to Arceus. The smell acts as a defense mechanism to ward off potential predators, and it is very potent. By allowing good airflow, the stink will get blown out of the enclosure and away from you and your Caterpie. But if you don't live somewhere that's warm all year round, then I would suggest keeping the enclosure inside and using glass walls instead. It will unfortunately almost take up the same space as a fridge, but at least you can place it anywhere in your home. Just make sure that you either have a door installed on the side or make it so that one of the glass panels is removable so you can get in to clean it. As for the inside of the enclosure, just a few branches that the Pokemon can use to climb should be fine. You can use fake branches, but just make sure there aren't any fake leaves on those fake branches. Caterpies are voracious eaters, and if something even so much as looks like a leaf, they will take a bite out of it. But we'll cover food later on. Oddly enough, Caterpie is an example of the Pokemon that gets easier to care for when it evolves. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's an amazingly pleasant event. As for how to care for a Metapod, you pretty much don't do anything to it. When it evolves, your Pokemon will either have attached itself to the branches in its enclosure using string, or will have settled itself on the floor of the enclosure. Either way, just grab it from wherever it's sitting and place it somewhere warm while you wait for it to evolve again into your Butterfree. Use it as a paperweight on your desk, a cuddle buddy during the night, or heck, just leave it on your counter near the sink. Just somewhere that you can keep an eye on it. Butterfree is also a low-maintenance Pokemon, but for different reasons than Metapod. You see, as a Butterfree, the risk to them from bird Pokemon goes way down. Butterfree have a natural defense mechanism, just like Caterpie with its smelly horn, but theirs is much more effective. When a Butterfree flaps its wings, it scatters poisonous scales in the air around it. These scales, while not deadly, can cause irritation, blindness, and even partial short-term paralysis. The scales are highly effective against all but fully evolved flying types, but thankfully those kinds of predators aren't common in the wild. Fire types could do damage too, but they aren't nearly as common in the wild as flying types. The problem is that the scales are also effective against people. Once your Metapod evolves into a Butterfree, you'll have to move it outside as a necessity to avoid poisoning yourself, which, you know, is bad. Moving it outside is really the only option at this point. Luckily, like I said, only fully evolved flying-type Pokemon can really do any kind of damage to a Butterfree now, so the risk of living outside is minimal at best. To further reduce that risk, you can build a small enclosure for your Butterfree. Really, it's going to be just more of a room, a place for your Pokemon to sleep at night and get away from any bad storms. The best way to do so is to make a wooden box, about 4 feet cubed to allow for the size of the Pokemon's wings, and attach it to the side of a tree, just under its lower branches. Then, on the side facing away from the tree, instead of a wooden wall, you want to make sure it's a heavy-duty rubber flap, like what they use for Pokemon doors for them to get in and out of a house. That way, it'll allow the Butterfree to come and go as it pleases, but won't let things like rain in. After that, just keep an eye on the box and make any repairs that are needed. The Butterfree should start to line the box with plants on its own once it feels comfortable enough in its new home. Always keep in mind that the specs for the enclosures I gave you before are only rated for 1, possibly 2 Caterpie and only 1 Butterfree. If you plan on housing other Pokemon with them, you'll have to either build a separate enclosure for those Pokemon, or adjust how you plan on housing your Caterpie evolution based on the Pokemon you'll be housing with them. Of course, other Caterpie evolutions are a yes. They're found in the wild in large nests, all living together. Just remember, you'll need space for them. And having a full nest of Caterpie can strip trees clean of leaves in weeks. Trust me, Mom and Dad have to rotate the Caterpie around from tree to tree each month just so they don't kill the trees by eating all of the leaves. You'll want to avoid fire types and flying types with them at all costs. Like I said before, they are the common predators of this species, and putting them together can be very, detrimental to your Pokemon's health. Just remember, I recommend keeping your Caterpie inside to avoid the dangers of flying types. Don't go sticking them together. Let's see. Anything carnivorous would be bad, unless you have a Butterfree to keep the younger evolutions safe. Caterpie and sometimes Metapod can make easy prey for carnivorous Pokemon. Grass types would be a good fit to house with them, ones like Badoo, Shroomish, things like that. Fairy types might also be a good fit. They tend to be caring Pokemon that'll take a shine to small Pokemon like Caterpie. Just things that aren't aggressive and will leave smaller Pokemon alone are what you're aiming for. Availability. We are going to do a small experiment. I want you to take out your phone, go over to your GPS, and find where the nearest forest is. Then grab an empty Pokeball and just walk around that forest for like an hour or two. You'll probably find a Caterpie. That's how easy it is to find these Pokemon. Now, of course I'm exaggerating, but not by much. They are almost everywhere. Eterna Forest, Lush Jungle, Viridian Forest, all of them. Out of all the different regions, the only 2 that don't have native Caterpie populations are Hoenn and Unova. And even if you live there, you can 100% find a breeder near you who is breeding and selling them. My parents did, still do as a matter of fact. They produce dozens and dozens of Caterpie per breeding season, and they are only one of hundreds of breeders of Caterpies out there. I personally don't breed them myself, partly because I have slight childhood trauma from being cocooned in string when I was really young while cleaning out the Caterpie nests, and partly because they're such a common Pokemon. If you want a Caterpie, you'll be able to find one, easily. Care. Following in the pattern of setting up their enclosure and getting a hold of one, the care for a Caterpie and its evolutions is very easy to handle. Starting off, their enclosure won't need much upkeep at all, aside from some regular cleaning. Sticky string will begin to accumulate inside their enclosure, hanging off the branches and the sides. This won't bother your Pokemon much, as in the wild they tend to live in nests made of the stuff. But the bigger problem is that other stuff, like the Pokemon's waste, can get caught in the string, and if left there, it can become a health risk. As Caterpie grow and get bigger and closer to evolving, they will shed their old exoskeletons, growing a new one as they do so. These old shell bits will also get caught up in the string. So, every few days, take the Pokemon out of the enclosure and use a Pokemon-safe dish soap to help dissolve and clean up the excess string. Then, let it dry, and once it's completely dry, you can replace your Caterpie and it'll all be good. I'm not really going to mention Metapod here. It doesn't move, it doesn't eat, it doesn't even make noise. The most cleaning you'll have to do is making sure that dust doesn't accumulate on it from wherever you put it. But Butterfree's enclosure will need to be cleaned out just like Caterpie's. They don't leave string everywhere, and since they should be living outside now aside from their box, all their waste is going to be outside. No, what you'll need to clean out are all the wing scales that build up in its treehouse. Like I said, as Butterfree flaps its wings, it spreads poisonous scales around in the air. Normally, the wind is enough to take care of this, and it scatters them around. But inside the box, that's not going to happen. All the scales that come off your Butterfree's wings while it's sleeping or eating will just build up in piles on the floor and in the corners. The best way to deal with this is to put on a pair of goggles and a mask so the scales don't get into your body, and vacuum them out about once a week. Please be careful when doing this. The scales may not be deadly, but if you inhale too many of them, it's going to lead to a trip to the doctor. And nobody wants to be the guy that had to go to the doctor from Butterfree poisoning. Moving on to food, it's probably the easiest diet that I've gone over so far in these care guides, which isn't saying much since it's only the fourth one, but still. For Caterpie, you'll need a water dish, one of the ones that hangs from the walls. You can get one of the ones that sits on the bottom of the enclosure, but that'll quickly get full of cast-off string and falling detritus from food. The one that hangs on the wall of the enclosure, while not free from the possibility of getting string in it, means you'll really only need to clean it every now and then when you need to replace the water. Speaking of the food though, I promised it would be easy, and it is. Leaves. Just regular old leaves. You have to remember that they live in trees in the wild, and all they eat is leaves. The best way to feed your Caterpie is, in the morning, you go outside, grab a big handful of leaves, and then drop them into your Pokemon's enclosure. It'll start nibbling on them almost instantly. Repeat that every morning, and if you happen to pass by the enclosure and see that they've eaten all the leaves, just go grab another handful. Remember that a Caterpie's only goal is to eat enough to evolve, and giving them all the food they can eat will only move them along in that goal. Once again, we're going to ignore Metapod. It doesn't eat anything. I'd call it a rock, but there are plenty of rock-type Pokemon that are actually more work to take care of. As for Butterfree, you have two options. The first is the natural route, letting Butterfree collect its own food from the environment. To do this, you'll need to plant plenty of flowers around the spot where you have your Butterfree's box hung. Then, your Butterfree will naturally go to those flowers to collect pollen to make honey to eat. The second option is to leave a small dish of honey out for it. Not in the box. In there it will quickly get covered in wing scales. But just leave it on your windowsill or your front porch. Your Butterfree will come over, eat its fill, and fly off. A little tip is that if you do this at the same time every day, then you will eventually train them to eat at that time every day, and they will approach you as you bring out their food. One last bit about caring for these Pokemon. During this whole care guide, I've been talking about what to do if you live in a warm climate, or if it's the warm season where you live, and how to take care of them during that. But what about winter? Well, bug Pokemon like Butterfree and Caterpie have plenty of different tricks to deal with the winter. So, let's say that you keep your Caterpie outside, or that you have such a large colony of Caterpie evolutions that they won't fit in your house. Well, don't worry about their health when things turn cold. At some point in the fall, usually after the leaves change color, but before the majority of them begin to fall to the ground, the cold temperatures will cause the Caterpie and their Butterfree to enter a sort of dormant state, hibernating through the winter in a warm, cozy spot. Usually, this means inside their big nests of string, and if you have your Caterpie outside, it will do just that. It'll make a big string ball at or near the top of its enclosure and encase itself in it, trapping in heat and keeping it safe for the winter. Butterfree, since it's already living outside if you've been following my guide, will simply enter its box and hibernate in there for the winter. This is one of the reasons that I mentioned getting a heavy rubber flap for the door. Most of the heavy-duty ones will trap in heat and keep out the cold while your Butterfree hibernates through the winter. Metapod, well, its shell is designed to keep it safe for the winter. Short of burying it in a snowbank, the winter isn't going to affect it much. But no matter what evolution you have, during the winter, just remember to check on them every few days to make sure the string ball is still intact for Caterpie and that your Butterfree is still sleeping healthy. Cost. Now, after the first 3 guides for the starters, I'm sure you're expecting me to say that the Pokemon is going to be expensive, and that you'll be spending most of your money there. Well, thankfully, you'd be wrong. In fact, you're not going to have to spend much money on this at all. Acquiring the Pokemon could possibly be as cheap as the price of a Pokeball if you go out and catch one yourself. And even if you decide to get one from a breeder or a personal seller, your costs won't be much higher than the low category. Like I said earlier, there are hundreds of breeders out there that are selling these Pokemon. And because the supply is so high, that means that the price has dropped to a nearly record low. Even if you don't want a Caterpie and want one of the later evolutions, it's not going to increase the price very much at all. In the same vein, food won't cost you much either. Caterpie will be free, just walk outside and grab a handful of leaves. Unless you're taking them from someone else's land, then you shouldn't have any trouble, and if you are doing that, stop it, that's rude. Butterfree, it depends on how much you want to spend on flowers, but at a minimum, you should be spending at about the upper rung of the low category, possibly into the moderate category. Surprisingly, flowers aren't cheap for some reason, and you'll need enough that your Butterfree doesn't keep going to the same ones day after day. It's all about how willing you are to put into the work to find them. Really, the spot where you're going to spend the most money is the enclosure. And by the most, I mean not much more than the moderate amount. You'll need wood, glass, and screws for Caterpie's enclosure, along with decorations like sticks and rocks, but again, just grab them outside, and then just wood and screws for Butterfree to make its tree box. The raw materials will probably put you somewhere in the middle of the moderate price category. Of course, you could always buy a prefabricated one online and have it shipped to you, skipping the need to go out and figure out how to build them yourself. Less work, but they are more expensive, putting you more in the higher range of the moderate price category. They aren't better, at least not usually, but they do save a lot of hassle getting the raw materials and putting it together yourself. Just searching for them online should bring up plenty of results. Conclusion. Personally, I think Caterpie and its evolutions are great first Pokemon, especially for kids. They're easy to care for, you can keep them in your house, at least before they're a Butterfree, and they look awesome in their enclosure. They aren't dangerous, and you can honestly take them out of their enclosure and interact with them really well. It builds a strong bond between owner and Pokemon. It's one of the reasons that the Caterpie line is so popular worldwide. It's also great for people that just don't have the time to invest in a Pokemon that needs constant training and attention. Getting one of these won't be a full-time job just to care for a Pokemon. Give it food and a bit of attention every now and then go on with your day. So, I personally think Caterpie and its evolutions are great Pokemon to have and could absolutely be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for tuning in, and next time we'll be going over what many people consider to be the counterpoint to the Caterpie line, the Weedle line. Which, oh boy, that's gonna be something. Have a wonderful night, everyone. You know, a lot of people consider the Caterpie and the Weedle lines to be almost twins. They're both from the same region, they start in a small worm-like form, evolve to a chrysalis state, and then have a final, larger form with wings. And they both tend to evolve quickly. But there are a few major differences that one would need to take into consideration when looking at these two lines. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, an ongoing series where we take a look at certain Pokemon species and how you would care for them in your own home. As I'm sure you figured out, we're going to be talking about the Weedle evolutionary line today. And to preface this, a lot of this is going to be similar to the Caterpie line's care guide. While they are two different species, I will grant that their first two evolutions are very similar. Weedle is a foot-long, worm-like Pokemon with a yellowish-brown coloring to its body, a large round head, and two barbs at either end, the front of which secretes a highly poisonous... poison. The second evolution, Kakuna, is a yellow, 2-foot-long chrysalis with two large black eyes on the top, very similar to Metapod. But the last evolution is where the two lines differ greatly. Beedrill is a 3-foot-tall, winged bug with a mostly yellow body that has black stripes on its abdomen. Oh yeah, and 3 poisonous barbs, one on its abdomen and one on each arm. They are wicked sharp, and, like I said, highly poisonous. But, just because it's got a poison touch, doesn't mean that it can't be a good Pokemon to have. And, who knows? It might just end up being the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Also, before we begin, I'm going to put a bit of a disclaimer here for a few things. One is that you should understand that this Pokemon line is often and widely considered a pest. Weedle and Beedrill have a habit of building their homes in or near places where people are. And that's a problem because Beedrill are very territorial and will attack anything that enters what they consider to be their space. There are plenty of reports of people being stung by Beedrills online. Professionals will oftentimes need to be called in just to deal with the infestation by catching all of the Pokemon with Pokeballs and relocating them to a better and safer location. One of my childhood friends actually grew up to become a pest control trainer. He always did have a thing for bug types, especially, funny enough, Beedrills. But speaking of needing to call in a professional, that brings me to another point. These Pokemon are the first ones we'll be going over who will actively attack people. The closest we've come to that in this series is a Charizard, but they'll often ignore people as they tend to think we aren't worth their time, essentially. Beedrill has no such problems going for people. And because of that extremely territorial nature, you will need a permit to own a Beedrill, or really any of the Weedle line. Permits allow you to legally keep certain species of Pokemon that governments deem dangerous. Getting one involves being tested on your knowledge of how to care for the Pokemon, how to interact with them, and how to possibly deal with being injured by them. Once the tester deems that you know what you're doing and can care for the Pokemon appropriately, they'll give you your permit. Mostly, the Pokemon that require permits to keep are a lot of the poison types, plenty of the fire and dragon types, and a smattering of the other types. A type of Pokemon isn't inherently dangerous, but there are some types, like poison types, that have more dangerous members than others. So, with those two warnings out of the way, let's talk about Beedrill. Enclosure. To be honest, their enclosure is very, very similar to the setup for the Caterpie line. They both live in large colonies that take over entire trees. And to be honest, Weedle would have a better chance surviving in a tree than Caterpie would because of its natural defenses. But even still, there are plenty of flying-type Pokemon that will power through to just get at an undefended Weedle. If you have a whole colony of Beedrill along with the Weedles, then yeah, that's plenty of defense for them to stay out in the tree. But I'll talk about why that is a terrible idea later on in this section. It would be better and safer for your Pokemon to keep it indoors until it reaches its final evolution. Weedle, being just a small worm-like Pokemon and only measuring a foot in length, can be kept in an enclosure in your house. In fact, I would recommend using the exact same setup that I described for the Caterpie line. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it, but I'll be sure to re-describe it here. The base of the enclosure should be 3 feet by 3 feet, and it should measure to be 5 feet tall, offering some vertical space for the Pokemon to climb and explore. The frame can be made of either wood or metal, but I always prefer wood because it's easier to work with. Metal can provide a good sturdy frame if you want to, though. The sides can either be mesh or glass, but I recommend glass. I've heard of Weedle getting their horns caught in the mesh and tearing it while freeing themselves, and then you have a venomous Pokemon loose in your home. Glass will probably be the better, safer alternative for both you and your Pokemon. Inside of the enclosure, you can decorate it with branches, either real or fake. The only thing with fake branches is that you need to be sure not to put fake leaves into the enclosure, because your Weedle will try to eat them, and that can lead to stomach problems if they've eaten a plastic leaf. Again, the Weedle line is one of the few evolutionary lines that becomes easier when it evolves. Kakuna is the exact same as Metapod. The chrysalis form doesn't move, it doesn't need to eat, it just needs to stay warm. It's just that Kakuna looks a lot more sinister than a Metapod does, with the large black eyes, at least in my opinion. But just put it somewhere where it'll stay warm and dry, and it should be fine. When it evolves, however, you'll want to make sure that it's outside when it does so. Beedrill can be problematic. Even when they don't mean to be harmful or dangerous, they have massive spikes for hands, and can cause some serious harm just by accident. When your Kakuna is getting close to evolving, make sure it's outside in a tree when it does so. This is because when a Beedrill does emerge from a Kakuna, wherever it is becomes its territory. So if it's in your house, then your house is now its territory. When your Kakuna is getting closer to evolving, you want to make the Beedrill's enclosure set up so that you can have it evolve outside. And a Beedrill's enclosure is going to be the same as a Butterfree's, though a bit bigger. Make a wooden box, 5 feet on all sides, and hang it from just below the lowest branches of a tree. On the side that faces away from the tree, instead of another wooden side, install a heavy-duty rubber flap that it can push out of the way to get in and out, but won't allow things like rain or snow in. Keep an eye on the box as time goes on, as thanks to the giant spike hands, it'll end up scratching and scraping the inside of it as it moves around. Repairs are going to be eventually needed. But this box will provide an excellent, safe spot for your Beedrill to live out of and be the center of what it considers its territory. Speaking of territory, let's talk about that and what other Pokemon you'll be able to house with the Beedrill. Quick answer, only other Weedle evolutions. Anything else and it'll be attacked by your Beedrill. And in my professional opinion, don't even house other Weedle evolutions with it. Nothing. Nada. Let me explain why I say that, though. A Beedrill's territorial instinct is partially a nature-learned thing, but it's also something that it learns from the rest of the colony as a way to defend the younger Weedle and Kakuna that are living with it in the hive. So if you raise your Pokemon from a Weedle and keep it separate from any other Beedrill evolutions, then its territorial instincts won't be nearly as aggressive as one who was raised in a colony. Instead, it'll only defend what it considers its home, which will be the tree that its box is housed in, and the surrounding approximate 30 feet. As an added bonus, since you raised it as a Weedle and have been around it its entire life, it'll consider you as a non-threat. You'll never be able to cuddle with it, but it shouldn't attack you when you're in its space. You'll just need to be vigilant for any other Beedrill colonies that pop up in the area, because if your Beedrill interacts with them, it'll try to join their colony, and then you'll either lose your Beedrill to that colony, or that colony will reject and attack your Pokemon, which would be very bad for its health. Either keep them isolated from others of their own species, or only house them with those that you have raised yourself, so as to not get swarmed when you enter their territory. Availability. While not as common as its twin Caterpie, Weedle are plenty common in the wild. I mean, if something can be considered a pest Pokemon, then by its very nature, it's gonna be a common sight. Believe me, my pest control friend I mentioned earlier loves bug Pokemon, even has a Beedrill of his own, but even he sometimes can't believe how many Weedle calls he gets a month. However, I do not recommend going out and catching one. It can be highly dangerous. Plenty of would-be Weedle owners have tried to catch one in the woods just to get swarmed by an entire nest of Beedrill. In many cases, the best way to get a Weedle is to buy one from a breeder. There are those out there who have managed to keep an entire colony of Weedle and its evolutions, but those are far and few between. Due to the difficulty in keeping more than one Beedrill in one place and then needing to collect the young Weedle to sell, many breeders consider Weedle a Pokemon that's more work than it's worth. And because of that fact, Weedle aren't nearly as available in the breeding circuit as Caterpie are. They are out there, you'll just have to put some work and money into getting one. Care. Fortunately, cleaning up after the Weedle line doesn't get much different from the Caterpie line. In the wild, a nest of Weedle, Kakuna, and Beedrill take over a tree or two as their nest, and the way they do that is through string. The Weedle will wrap the branches and leaves and even sometimes the trunk of trees in their string to form a large nest that the rest of the colony can live in. So, they will be attempting to do the same in their enclosure. Soon after placing your Weedle in its enclosure, you're going to start seeing large ropes of string start covering everything in it. It's not technically a bad thing, as a Weedle can't get caught or bound up in its own string, but things like rotting leaves and waste can. In the wild, Weedle usually just poop on the side of the tree. It falls to the ground and then decomposes rather fast. But that won't happen in its enclosure. So, about once a week, you'll need to get in there and scrape away any string that's gross or covered in stuff. It'll prevent it from starting to rot. I would suggest not scraping away all the string though. Doing this will not only stress your Weedle out, as it's going to feel unsafe without its string around it, but it's also going to have to put in the effort and time to redo all the string you just pulled out. It's best to leave any string that are in good condition in the enclosure. Moving on from Weedle, Kakuna doesn't really do anything. It physically can't make a mess. I would just take it out of the Weedle enclosure and place it somewhere warm and dry. And Beedrill doesn't grow as much as Weedle, so it won't leave discarded exoskeletons in its box as often, and it poops outside. The occasional sweeping of its box should be enough to handle Beedrill. So the worst of the cleaning is going to come when it's young and still a Weedle. Aside from that, cleaning up after this Pokemon is pretty easy. Feeding them is just as easy. When in the wild, all Weedle eat are the leaves off trees, so going outside and collecting a few handfuls should be good enough for your Pokemon. Just come inside and drop them into the enclosure. It'll start to munch on them almost immediately, I promise. Eating is nearly the only thing that Weedle do in preparation for evolution. So if you do this once a day, or whenever you see that your Weedle is out of food, then that should be plenty for this Pokemon. Complement that with a water spigot that hangs on the side of the enclosure, and your Weedle should be poised to grow into a perfectly healthy Kakuna. And speaking of Kakuna, you don't have to feed it. Since your Pokemon is in a chrysalis-like state, it doesn't require food or water to remain healthy. Again, find a spot that's just warm and dry, and that's all they'll need. When it comes to Beedrill though, some people look at it and think, wow, that's a big Pokemon. It must need a ton of food to eat every day. And look at those weapons it has for hands. There's no way that this thing is anything but a predator. But no, they aren't a predator. The large needles, while being intimidating and absolutely dangerous, are more for defending their territory. They may actively attack anything they perceive as a threat, but it isn't in an effort to eat whatever they're attacking. Beedrill actually have the same eating habits as a Butterfree. They feed off pollen and nectar that they gather from nearby plants and flowers. So, your best bet on feeding these guys is to get a collection of flowers and plants, then plant them around your tree that'll be your beedrill's home. Once the flowers bloom, there'll be plenty of pollen for them to eat. If your flowers aren't blooming yet, or you just don't want to deal with the hassle of planting flowers, which, trust me, I hate doing garden work, then a feeder will work just as well. Just fill it with honey. I prefer to get my honey right from a comb bee farm, as I feel like it tastes better, but if you go to the store and get the store brand stuff, then that should work just fine. And you can also buy the feeders for them online or at a Pokemon care store. I also want to mention that if you live in a colder area where winter is a thing, then your Weedle Evolution Pokemon will enter into a dormant state for the winter. At some point during the fall, they'll enter their nest, whether that be a space that you provide them or a nest they made themselves, and fall into a sort of hibernation state. This is perfectly natural, and there is no need to panic if you don't see your Pokemon for a couple of months. Just make sure that they'll stay warm through the season, and will have plenty of food once they wake up in the spring. After such a long nap, they're going to be hungry. Oh, and this should be said, Weedle and its evolutions can survive a winter, but won't make it an area that's always cold year-round. So places like Snowpoint City or Snowbell City would be bad spots for these Pokemon. Pretty much anywhere that has snow in the name isn't a good habitat for Weedle and its evolutions. Unless you're having them live indoors, but an indoor Beedrill habitat is not recommended. Cost. Weedle evolutions are a frustrating Pokemon to get a hold of. They aren't common in the breeding industry, mostly because they're such a pain, figuratively and literally, to raise, keep, and sell. So finding one for sale can be a bit of a pain. But they're so common in the wild. You hear about Weedle and Beedrill infestations all the time, and walk through almost any forest and you'll find a nest of them. But catching one is dangerous enough that I wouldn't recommend it at all. So it's this irritating feeling of, I see them everywhere, but I can't get a hold of one. And because of the inherent danger in getting one from the wild, most people go through breeders. And with the low number of breeders that supply these Pokemon, and the effort involved in raising them, the price for these Pokemon will tend to be in the moderate range. Which, I'll admit, is unusual for bug Pokemon, as they tend to be more common overall. But that's just how the Weedle market has settled over the years. The enclosure material will most likely cost around the moderate category as well. Between the material for the frame, the glass, and all the screws, bolts, and hinges, really, this is the same as the Caterpie and Butterfree's enclosure. You'll have to build them once you get all the materials, but that shouldn't take too long or be too tough to do. There are the pre-made ones that you can buy online, of course, but they'll put you in the higher end of the moderate price range. They're nice, and an Arceus send if you don't really have the technical skill to build your own, but you guys know me. I always prefer the homemade option over the store-bought one. Plus, in this case, it does end up being cheaper. Food will be the one place where you can potentially spend either the least amount of money or the most. After all, for Weedle, all you need to do is go out and grab some leaves off the nearest tree. Free is the best price for food. But even if you don't have a spot where you can grab leaves off the nearest tree, you can order them online for very low prices. They come in massive big bags for real cheap. Beedrill's flowers are where you might spend more money. Flowers, for some unknown reason to me, can cost quite a lot depending on the kinds you get and how much you get of them. Really, any kind of flower will do for your Beedrill, so if you can find some wildflowers to transplant around your Beedrill's enclosure, then that'll make the flowers free as well. But if you want to get specific ones, then the price can be anywhere between low and the high part of the moderate category. Like I said, flowers are strangely expensive. Conclusion. In my opinion, the Weedle line is for more experienced bug handlers. Between the venom and the territorial behavior of the last evolution, only people that know what they're doing and how to handle something like that should handle them. Like my friend Logan. He actually has a beedrill of his own, and even he says sometimes that it's a tough bug to handle. And this man dives headfirst into venipede nests, so if you're considering getting a Weedle evolution, be sure that you can handle it, because they can become too much very fast. However, for those out there who do have the skill and the know-how on how to handle these tough bugs, it very well may end up being that these are your perfect Pokemon partners. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time to go over the flying-type Pokemon Pidgey and its evolutions Pidgeotto and Pidgeot. Have a wonderful night, everyone.